Welcome back to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for bias, ethical risk, and effective governance. I'm joined once again by my partners in crime, Jeffery Recker and Bryan. Thanks for showing up again, guys. I think this has become a regular thing. So the big question is, what do we talk about today? And I think probably the bigger question is can we talk about everything that's going on? Answer is no. There's so much going on that it's going to be impossible. We've got a new administration in the U.S., which is casting a lot of uncertainty on the regulatory landscape around AI, which is something we have to track very closely here at BABL. And in Europe, regulations are starting to kick in, and then there's many things in between that we can talk about. So I'm going to kick it off maybe to Jeffery. What are your thoughts? What do you think we should be talking about?
Thank you for that. Also, I don't know if I caught this before, but you called me Jeffery Recker, which is how I pronounce it in my small hometown. And then everywhere else it's Recker. So if that confuses you, nobody paid attention to that, I'm sure, but I noticed it. So thank you for that. Also, I think this is like the 9th time we've said this is becoming a regular thing. So we should just say it's a regular thing, maybe, or keep making the jokes. I'm not traveling this time, so I can't make that joke. Yeah, a lot going on. I think I'll start by saying, talk about my responsible AI course that went out. Just kind of, that was really fun. Had a ton of people sign up. A few hundred people showed up to the live recording. Really appreciate everyone that came and was a part of that. It's still up if anybody wants to take it. Yeah, just giving people an introduction to the topic. Had a lot of conversations come out of that with some interesting people all over the world. So that was really cool. And I think I'm going to be doing another one, and this one's going to be probably some type of like introduction to the EU AI Act. So kind of introducing people to it, high level. What is it? What do they need to be concerned about? Throw in a bunch of useful resources for them to navigate the law themselves if it's relevant for them. I think we'll see. I might have it available by the time this goes live. Hopefully I do. Still working out some kinks on what I think it might look like, but yeah, I think this will be fun. This will be another fun one, which I think is a good segue into what you just listed as to what we should probably talk about, and that is just the regulatory. I don't know if I want to say chaos.
Dichotomy between dichotomy is the right word. We're on opposite ends of the spectrum here.
Yes, it's all over the place. So we have a new administration, and I think that is just all uncertainty. And then you have all of these states in the U.S. that are pushing through their own things. Canada's AI Act, I don't know if you guys saw this, but it was left on the cutting room floor. It doesn't look like that's going to be moving forward. And then while that's all happening, the EU AI Act took effect. So maybe we can start with that. Shea, maybe you want to just kind of let us know, what do people need to do now? What has all come into effect, because this is coming in stages, like what's important today. And then from there, we'll contrast that to the rest of the world as it will. And we'll try and not just be US and EU. I think I'll try and find some stuff on the side to talk about as well that is interesting. Korea just passed AI Basic Act as well. So yeah, kind of introduce us to what has happened in the EU and what is relevant.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about EU in this podcast before. It's been coming for a long time, and February 2nd was the time. So it's been in force, quote unquote, in force for a while, but now the first obligations have come into force where companies are actually responsible for doing something. And so the two most relevant things are Article 4 and Article 5. So Article 4 is AI literacy. So this is a requirement for companies that kind of are either using, deploying, or are somehow involved in the value chain of AI to make sure that their workforce, anywhere from like a general person who might be using a chat bot to do their job, to someone who's very technical and a technical specialist who's building in this AI, to like an HR person who's using it for a very specific task quite heavily. All of those people have to have a certain level of AI literacy, which is unspecified. But they do say that it has to depend on the role and the risks associated with it. And that AI literacy, the content of it, is centered around whether what are the obligations under the act. And we already have courses on this, and Jeffrey you'll be giving that nice overview of that coming soon. The second thing, and that's something that's required now. So if you don't have that now, you are already violating the law. So we'll talk about enforcement maybe later on in the podcast, but right now you are violating the law if you are either selling into the European Union, or you're currently in the European Union and using AI or developing it, and you don't have that AI literacy in place. Article 5 is the prohibited practices. And so there are certain AI systems which are prohibited, and they have to do with things like social scoring, emotion detection or manipulation of people, remote sort of biometric surveillance en masse, like in public spaces, that kind of thing. Those are prohibited practices, and though if you're doing those now, it's illegal. And so, and the European Commission just put out a couple days ago a detailed report on exactly what those are, and use case examples and things. So you can check those out as well. So those are now in force. And two other quick things, like in terms of timeline. April is when the standards bodies are going to actually come out with the standards for all the other systems. That's probably going to get pushed back, but that's like the next thing you should be keeping an eye out for. CENELAC is the group.
Do you have any thoughts or predictions on what that's going to look like?
Yes, it's going to be. We know a lot of people in that, so I don't want to disparage the process, but it's going to look a lot like ISO audits. It's going to be fair ISO standards. It's going to be fairly high level, but it's going to give guidance on like what do they mean by technical documentation. What do they mean by risk assessment? That sort of thing. There will not likely be any surprises, so companies shouldn't be waiting around for those before they start implementing things. But there will be more details coming out in April. I think we've heard that it's going to get pushed back, and so that's all the more reason not to wait around for those. And even when they come out, they're going to be very high level. You're still going to have to figure out in the context of your organization how to do these things. The next deadline, the big deadline is August. And August is when the enforcement bodies on all the state enforcement bodies. So in each member state of the EU, so France, Germany, all of those, they are each going to have their own kind of surveillance body, which is going to basically look at the companies that are operating within their jurisdiction and sort of implement the enforcement. Those don't have to be designated yet, not until August. And so even though there are requirements now, there's likely not too many organizations actually enforcing it at the moment.
So I'm curious what actions would you say, what should be the next steps that a company takes to get ready for compliance? Is it looking at getting ISO certified?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I think the number one thing is AI literacy, right? So if I were like putting out a fire, actually I put something out on LinkedIn, or BABL put it out. I posted it, which is like the 5 steps to AI literacy. But the fact of the matter is, you have to know what AI you're using. You have to know who's using it. You got to figure out a little bit of the risk, because that's gonna sort of tell you how much literacy these people need to know, depending on the risk. And then you have to start planning out what are the things that people need to know in those roles, and then you get to deploy it. If you haven't done that right now, you're breaking the law. And so that's the fire you got to put out first. Now, in the process of doing that, you have to know what you're using for AI and who's using it. That's the first step in all the other stuff. Because once you have that, then you can start thinking about how would we get coverage. And to your point, ISO 42001 actually is in the absence of the standards being done, ISO 42001 is going to get you 90% of the way or 85% of the way. And so it's not a bad place to start. But some of the things that we do as a company, some of the assurance engagements around details of technical testing, details of risk management, those are also good activities to get done ahead of time, where you have an outside person come in and really check your homework. All of those are going to be fruitful, because the fact is, by August of next year, that's when the law comes into full force for all the annex, like all the typical AI systems that we're thinking of, like HR and education. And that's not a very long time to get prepared. And so anything you can do at this point to get prepared, you better be doing it.
Sounds like people need to start learning. There's lots of activity on the education side, just on that literacy component. I hear in lots of conversations, either with our customers or just kind of in the community, everybody's talking about AI literacy these days. And yeah, definitely getting those programs in place. I know we put the AI literacy courses out, but having a lot more conversations with organizations concerned about this right now. And you know, it's interesting. It's a great kind of stair step into some of those more internal mechanisms that organizations need to develop in terms of skills. So that's also been creating a lot more internal risk audit functions within organizations. So I think what I'm seeing on the business side of all of this kind of, you know, roadmap of regulation is almost new roles becoming that, and we've kind of predicted this, but that new role of kind of internal auditor, internal risk, AI governance, like those skill sets are, you know, I think what are these new jobs that I keep hearing about. Those are going to be those in-demand jobs, those internal risk, those AI governance leaders. So definitely excited, and you'll hear some more stuff from BABL on that. We want to stay ahead of the curve like we've been as just an organization generally on this topic. So stay tuned on you know, any of our socials, and you know, pay attention. We'll be putting some more great content out to fill that kind of workforce gap. But I would say that regulation is going to help fill some of those job openings that are going to be happening too, as kind of AI switches in the workforce. So it is wild. There's lots of complex decisions and happenings within organizations right now. But
yeah, Shea, I have half of a thought of a question for you. So
I don't know what that is.
I know, right?
Half of a thought of a question. All right.
Is it a triple negative? I don't know.
I think it's a third of a thing. I'm a math guy, I think. Yeah, I do all the quant here.
So something I've seen talking to companies, and we've been seeing this for a few months now, but I think it's becoming a little more prevalent, is companies that used, you know, they've had AI for years, but it's like this old school thought of AI, or you know, they have some function and there's like components of AI kind of built into that, whether it's like, you know, some HR tool, or some educational tools or whatever it is. And then all of a sudden now people seem, you know, as these companies are selling into organizations, they're starting to see pain from stakeholders, right? Specifically, especially if they're selling to, you know, companies that operate in the EU, there's now this pressure for, you know, compliance that they've never had to deal with before. They're getting asked questions around things they've never had to ask before. But also this is happening in the fringes, right? So it's not as like explicit as, oh, I just built an AI chat bot that's going to help this interview process. It's more granular. It's more like these old school algorithms out there. The half of a thought of a question that I have is, if you could think of, like, I don't know, maybe it's a thought experiment or a question that somebody should ask as they're looking internally at the type of tools that they're using. What's something unexpected that they should look at, something that's not obvious, or a way to look at something that could be considered high risk, whether it is like an old school process, a type of AI they haven't considered before, a tool or an industry or some type of vendor that they're talking to. What's some uncertain things that someone should have in front of them as this comes into action?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the it all ties back to risk. So it's going to be so at the highest level, your business is providing value to people through services or products, and you are using technology, AI, to somehow make that better, faster, cheaper, easier, whatever, right? And just like regular enterprise risk management, you need to think about what are the risks this has introduced. And so so that's all kind of like that should be table stakes. But I think the problem is people don't understand. And to your point, there's a lot of like fringe things happening. So regular products like Slack and others, places where you communicate, places where you just store data, those now have AI capabilities. And so keeping an eye out for that is one. And then there are clear questions about what happens to your data, how the AI is using your data or not. There's some sort of standard data privacy things. Now, I think for a lot of that, there are capabilities out there in organizations. Um, it's the things that go unnoticed are a lot of the validation kind of questions and operational kind of questions. So what I mean by that is if I can use something if I can use AI in a process, I have to ask myself, and that some vendors trying to sell me this, I have to ask myself, how are they convinced, or can they convince me that this is actually doing what they say it's doing? It actually is going to replace the human and the human judgment. And as we get more and more agents and agentic behavior that are just literally taking over many, many processes and it just happens automatically, it's going to be more and more important to ask the critical questions of, are there elements of this that are not getting covered that would have been covered if I had a human doing it? And has this system been tested and validated in a way that is convincing enough to me as the buyer, or as the person who's going to approve it for an internal development, that it's worth the money and it doesn't introduce new risks? That's not an easy answer. I know, like, there's no like, I mean, we actually do have a rubric, like a cheat sheet you could use, like of questions to ask, but uh, it's going to be very complicated, and it's going to happen in the edges of where you work, and those processes, and it's not going to be an easy task.
Let me let me explore that thought maybe just a little bit further with just a basic example. So you mentioned Slack, right? So Slack and all of the software that we use pretty much is injecting AI in every other day, like new capabilities, features, whatever. Um, it's really interesting because a lot of the conversations I have with certain vendors that I'm trying to do the responsible thing, so I can verify and validate that my tool that I'm creating is done in a responsible, ethical way. I got my audit, we're good. But as soon as it goes into somebody else's system, the intended use of their algorithm of that can turn that output into something that is, non-responsible or not compliant. So everybody has to kind of build these little contractual, protections and boundaries. But if they're just injecting it in and it's happening daily and we don't have all that information, it's, that creates a lot of like challenges, I think, for organizations just to like keep pace, as they're almost being forced to accept new artificial intelligence or automation from the software that they're employing. And I would say that that creates a lot of liability on the end customer of these softwares if they're just getting it shoved down their throat, and lack of a better term. But you can't build policies for the scale at which your software is injecting AI in. And all of that liability comes down to, the organization to keep pace with making sure that their entire organizational algorithmic systems and all these softwares connect and they're used responsibly and people are trained. And that's a ton of pressure on the end customer to try to solve, if it's just getting pushed on them. I think that's really challenging. But Slack was like a great example of, it just, they turn it on, and I don't have a better example. I'm not saying they're bad or good or anything. It's just choice. But new features come on every single day, and I see it in software that I use, and it's like, hey, we're going to summarize all of your stuff now, and you can click this button, and we'll send emails for you. And people have no idea how to use this stuff in a lot of capacities. So it is really interesting, but I think it's a lot of obligation on the end customer.
I have another question, unless Shea, you want to react to that?
No. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, you spot on, and I think it's that's the uncertainty. That's what's going to kill your adoption, and get people not to buy your product unless you manage that as a vendor really well.
Yeah, it's an opportunity for these vendors. If you're listening, vendors, win with trust.
Yeah, of course. So I want to kind of segue this into what's happening in North America. And there's a lot of focus on the US, obviously, and the fragmentation that is going on, and the deregulation at the federal level, and just some high level stuff. I think anybody has even got a pulse at this point knows all of the rapid movement that's happening in the US. But outside the US, there's stuff going on as well. So I want to segue into this, but I have a question that's kind of in between the two, right? So I want to segue into the US. And I think the three laws that are most prevalent for people that are using or developing AI tools are going to be the EU AI Act, the Colorado AI Act, and the New York Local Law 144, which requires bias audits of HR tools. There's a lot of different schools of thought when it comes to what is risk and what falls under compliance with these laws. And of course, there's other ones like Illinois, Colorado, or California. But in that, I think there's also a lot of gray area in terms of like, what is AI, what falls in terms of compliance. And I'm curious, Shea, I'm going to poke your brain on this one. Like, how do you navigate that? How do you get clarity on that? Is there a North Star that you can reach for? Do you just do compliance across the board and all of these testing across the board just to be safe? Can you talk to that grayness at all, especially with so much uncertainty coming in along in the North America?
Yeah. So I think in the presence of uncertainty, so I like to think of everything kind of at first principles level as best because there is a lot of uncertainty, and the more uncertainty there is, the more you have to fall back on principles or and things that are sort of immutable that are going to be around, right? And so I think that in this space, some of the first principle thinking that companies should be doing is around the aim of most of these laws. So the general aim of most of these laws is that they have recognized that there are risks externally to people that the AI gets either used on, or that the end user that is using an AI system to talk with it, to use it to do their business, whatever, makes decisions about them. And so those are the risks, and there's a whole subset of risks like discrimination. You could just look at the fundamental human rights if you wanted a list. Right to an education, right to be employed, the right to not be discriminated against, things like this. And so that's what most of these laws are aiming at. And so the details of what they require all are pointing towards mitigating those risks. And so if I'm thinking from a business perspective and a first principles perspective, I need to understand how these tools are being used by my company or by my end users if I'm making them, and how that will impact the rights and interests of those people that interact with it. And so this is why when we teach our courses, we have this sort of idea of like CETA framework, which is context, input, decision, action. What are those consequential actions that happen at the end of that? What is the context? Like who's using it where and how? How much do they understand about it? And so there are some fundamental things. And so if I were to like operate under this uncertainty, I would focus on those things. Can I have a risk management system in place that is going to actually substantively track and mitigate those risks? Now, if I want a North Star, I can go look at the EU AI Act. I can look at some of the ISO standards that will point to that. I can look at the NIST risk management framework. Some of these things are called out directly in the law, like EU is a law. Colorado calls out ISO 42001. But at the core of it, the central engine is being able to track that risk, the risk and impact assessments. And in my mind, that's the core. And once you have that core down, where the right stakeholders in your organization understand the risks, so they've been educated on those risks, they understand the technology, and they are tracking those risks. They have KPIs around them. They have risk mitigations in place, or at least they've, if not, they've accepted the residual risk, to use some risk language. And there's clear communication about that across the organization. Everything else is going to be gravy, basically. Everything else is going to be like, I need to document it in a certain way for EU or whatever. And so from a first principles point of view, and we've constructed our whole audit framework around this, we've constructed our whole education system around this. And in fact, it's the way, humans should operate in the world is this kind of first principles thinking. So if you can get that in your organization, then everything else is going to be gravy, in my opinion.
I concur. Yeah, no, that first principles approach allows organizations to be really dynamic in how they're addressing the challenges in front of them. And what I to the aim of regulation, generally speaking, I think globally, what I pick up on, without being a legal expert, is we're trying to create outcomes that don't hurt people. But I think you could also maybe even reframe that as maybe the aim we should be shooting for is outcomes that benefit people, right? And I think more, and I always think markets and movements of people and ideas, and um, you know, nobody loves outcomes that push them into places they don't want to be. And I think you could probably, have a competitive advantage if you are prioritizing the aim of the regulation, which is don't harm people, basically, if we want to boil it down to a thing. And then a competitive advantage would be, how do we take that and then find value beyond that? Because I think that's a great way to attract customers. And I certainly think about AI in a really optimistic way, if I think about it that way, and that this is a really cool way for businesses to prioritize, that responsible, ethical use of AI, and then use that as a real competitive advantage. Because organizations that take the path of least effort and just trying to get as much either profit or speed to market or all this very short-sightedness, I think those are losing strategies at this point. Because I do think markets are ready for AI in a way that helps them. I think there's a lot of resistance to what I see some of the AI being put in place. So if you're out there losing customers and you haven't done the hard work of getting it right, maybe do a little root cause analysis of why they're leaving you, right? Maybe the products aren't good. But I hope, generally speaking, most organizations are building towards how do we bring value in the value chain. And I think that's a great approach that organizations should have. It's a good mindset. And yeah.
So I'm curious because what's being talked about is not a small thing.
Mhm.
It's actually quite a large thing when you implement this stuff. And I think the bigger the organization, the more complex and the harder it gets, and the smaller the organization, the fewer resources they have to execute and execute well, I would assume. So, what would you say then to a company just kind of looking at the contrast of the EU to North America, um, to especially like a smaller organization that's operating in the US, who now, and I'll just kind of go through some of the things that have happened in the last few weeks. Um, Biden's executive order was replaced. The AI and is it data something? The AI Act in Canada was terminated. Um, basically any hope of a U.S. equivalence to the AI Act at the federal level is gone. And then you have more granular um, or industry specific, or maybe people just aren't worried about some city going after them, like New York. Oh, we'll just stop hiring in New York, and we don't have to worry about that law type thing. So what do you say to organizations looking at the U.S. and this world of like deregulation or free market getting away and trying to contrast to that?
I'll jump in there first, Shay, if you don't mind.
Please.
I mean, it's in my opinion, I mean, it's free market, right? We're capitalism all the way, baby. Let's go, right? That's what's going to lead the charge with respect to doing things with AI in the United States, um, and I think that's fine because it in a lot of cases, like when I'm on sales calls, it's more, well, I'm only doing this because I can't get past procurement, right?
Can I be devil's advocate there for a second though?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
People that are coming to us have already had that problem. So I'm speaking beyond that hurdle of people that are already like coming to us.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying right now, and this I was going to build to the point of
Okay.
the end customer is the line is the guard. If end customers take a position of I don't want to accept risky AI into my enterprise, my business, then it forces people to prove that their product is not risky. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying just a little bit ago of if these softwares are just injecting AI, ad hoc without, a lot of, testing or whatever into their customers' environments and creating a lot of risk for their customer and passing that risk on without them even being able to know, like there should be a lot more scrutiny. Like if I'm a business owner, I'm going to be really focused on making sure that I'm not opening myself up to risk caused by someone else's product. And they should put real hard procurement rules in place because if something goes wrong, you don't want to have that bad brand because it's going to get passed on to you. It's not going to be, you know, there's going to be leaks, there's going to be problems. But I think procurement is the defense line and it's just going to be business to business. And I think
So
that's got to be this line in the sand between it's the transaction point. Do you accept risky AI into your organization? Or are you going to have a little bit more like posture? And I think individual entities that are buying software should be a little bit more focused on putting a moat like around their risk with better procurement. And I think that will help kind of mitigate some things, or at least force, because when people are building AI as fast as humanly possible to try to get it to market and the market doesn't accept it because it's not good enough to the market standard, it's not bringing enough value to them. That's where you're going to see people say, I don't want AI. I don't want that anymore. Right.
so
That's a risk on me. And I think the market can push back a little bit and force better, responsible, ethical, built product. And I think it's a combination of education, right? Both sides of that transaction need to really understand that risk. And
so
it's not just like the data engineer people. it's business decision leaders, strategists, and all of those types of individuals that really need to understand how this could be a downstream negative impact for them. So I think I can repackage the whole capitalist thing as like a positive. However, we see greed creep into the mix, and people want that money right now, and they're willing to take that short-term profit. So
So
I don't know. We'll see.
I don't want to open up Pandora's box with this thought
That's
experiment that I have, but I'm going to play devil's advocate again.
beautiful.
I think the election is, you know, is a reflection of certain things going on in society, right? I think that's categorically a fact. And regulations come as a byproduct of a reaction to something going on in society. And we're talking about the negative effects of AI, and I prescribe to them, right? I think all of those negative effects are very real and they need to be taken very seriously. But the contrast is we live in a world where the reality, every person shares a different reality now, right? Uh, we have bubbles of thought everywhere. And the reality of millions of people all over the world, and especially in the United States, and our elections are a reflection of this, believes that those things are not real. And I think the deregulation and this going after DEI and all of these things is a reflection of that. And I would say that for every person that says that there's risk and an algorithm can be racist, there's likely somebody on the other side that says that's not real. Algorithms cannot be racist. It's A plus B always equals C, and we don't need to inject all of these things in place, let capitalism happen. And to the point that I hear is being made is that, like, build trust and all of this stuff. You should do all of these things to build better algorithms, and I personally think you should. But my guess is, if you're saying let the market kind of dictate and self-select, there's likely millions of people willing to buy a product that say, hey, we don't do these things, or they just don't care to even look at it.
All right, I got that. So, so you're right. I think there is a lot of, people on all sides of the conversation, but the people that we really need to understand the risk, it's not everybody. It's the people making decisions within an organization, right? They're the leaders. They set the tone. They set the bar, and everybody follows along lines, right? Like we see this. Everybody's on the bus, and there's one driver.
But here,
for that analogy, I think business leaders generally need to really understand the two paths in front of them. I can go fast and risky, and hopefully I'll make some money really quick, and I'll deal with the risk down the line. But they are exponential with AI. Like we know things happen quickly. The other side, and let me just finish this, is I'm going to go a little bit slower. I'm going to do it right. I'm going to protect my customers, because at the end of the day, most of these, what we're talking about is that stakeholder at the end of the value chain, the customer. It's their privacy, it's their data, it's the risk affecting them, and I think a business leader who has a little bit of foresight and a little bit of patience is going to be able to protect their audience, their customer base, much better than a risky approach. And we all know it's all about audience these days.
But here's the point. Here's an example of what I mean by this, and why I do wonder if we're walking into a world where there's multiple markets. And I think AI very much could do the same thing. And that is social media. And what has happened in the last about 6 years, especially, is social media has not consolidated, it is fractured. Normally in markets, especially large markets and tech markets, there's a consolidation of IP, right? The bigger pieces buy up the smaller pieces, and eventually there's a handful of players. But what's happened is, because of politics or whatever, there's been more of a fragmentation. You have things where it's like, oh, okay, well, I can't get the thoughts that I want from this platform. Well, now there's a new platform. Now there's Truth Social, there's Blue Sky, there's all of these new little platforms coming out, and it's a reactions to these, making companies do certain things or reacting to a market.
Keyword reaction. You do not want to react with AI. You want to be proactive. You want to have strategy, because you can't react fast enough to AI. This stuff changes every 20 minutes. Like, I'm on LinkedIn all day, every day, and I'm like, man, like I can't keep up with
It's
any of the
impossible.
news feeds. Like, it's happening so fast. So that's why I say step back a little bit. There's a lot of noise, and come up with a strategy that works to make sure your customers are protected. And I think
Yeah.
that's a winning long-term strategy. I don't know if it works super short-term, because everybody's like frothing at the mouth for AI anything. But certainly I do think there's guardrails that can be put in place in a capitalist system, and regulation. The aim is there, and it gets people to a point. But I would say even in a regulated space, and Shea, you mentioned it, right? ISO gets you maybe 90% of the way there. Like, it's still not quite good enough. There's still openings to be better. And if you want to really be a leader and like a true innovator pioneer with AI and win in new markets, you got to go in places where like customers are excited to follow. In my opinion, that's just me and my empirical gut feeling. Sales guy, not a researcher, but
Yeah.
you know.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah. So right now it is pretty, like, we do have different opinions, right? Between Europe and the US, even within the US, different opinions. And I think that at the end of the day, not all of the risks that we think about or look at can be traced back to, some kind of, uh, personal identity bias, some sort of, worry about culture stuff. It's not really that. And I think what we're going to see is, as people's jobs start disappearing, average people's jobs start disappearing, and not, white collar jobs start disappearing, people who maybe were unconcerned about the risks are going to start asking tougher questions. Like, you just replace me with a thing. Is that thing as good as I am at that task? Is there a part for me to play in making sure that that's as good as I am? What am I doing now? How am I getting compensated? They're going to start asking tougher questions. And it's not about personal identity. It's not about any kind of political divide you want to sort of artificially put in there. It's about humans and your nature of humans, and your sort of your ability to do meaningful work in the world. And so I think the demand will be, and I think that we need to push, and companies need to push, if they want to be a significant player and get significant adoption, and they don't want to be hated across the world, they have to put in the right kind of care to demonstrate that they're adding value, and they are not simply wholesale. Because if you look at what people are doing now, to be totally frank, and I'll kind of not to be too critical of, in the end of the day, our clients, or prospective clients, but a lot of what people are doing are taking these models, which are agents in some sense. Like, they have, you can think about them as like new employees in some ways, and they're just sticking them everywhere they can automate something, and they haven't really thought through, or they're doing it so fast, and the rush is so urgent, because they feel like they just got to be the first to market for all of these various things that can be automated, that they haven't really done the right kind of diligence to actually add real enterprise value. And so if I'm talking just pure business perspective, and I'm thinking like an investor, right? If I just slap a wrapper around GPT 4.0 or 1.0 or 01 or whatever the newest model, or Anthropic, and it's just super basic prompt engineering thing just to replace a person, then you were basically replacing a person who is professionally trained to do a thing with a general model with a couple of prompts. And so what you're basically telling that person is, I can sum up your whole life and job with about 200 lines of prompt and a couple lines of code for, like, go back and self-reflect, right? That is not, now these things are powerful, but that is not actually going to cut it. And so if I'm a business person building these things, it should be front and center in my mind to demonstrate to myself, demonstrate to the clients, demonstrate to the person who I just booted out of a job that I have done my due diligence to make sure it is as good or better for that particular task that that human could do. And if they haven't done that, they're not going to be worth anything as a company, because it's really just slapping a little bit of code. Anybody can go out and do it. And everybody is going out and doing it. And that's not going to be long-term value. And we're just going to see a bunch of companies get started, get funded, they're going to crash. And then the few companies who've really taken it seriously in each vertical, in each industry, they're going to win. And part of taking it seriously is understanding ethics, understanding the risk, regardless of political, understanding safety, understanding what it means to build enterprise value. And I think that is across the political spectrum. And as soon as you start seeing people, everyday average Joe, getting their jobs taken away, you're going to start seeing people care about that. And that's going to translate into regulations. It's going to translate into all of the things that are currently not there. That's my opinion, of course. Anyway,
it's an opinion I agree with, Shea. How's that?
Yeah, I'd say I agree with that as well. I'd say too, this term human-centered design, I think is at the core of that, and it is something that I think throughout the modern history, that this technology revolution of the last like 50 years or so, so much of this stuff is designed to disrupt, and so much of this stuff is, also designed to connect, right? Social media, again, is an example. But so often, to your point, Shea, I think you're 100% right. We're so fast to be first in the market. We're so fast to react to the market. We're so fast to get those share prices up and implement AI. Where a DeepSeek is just launched, and it reinvigorated the entire. You saw the reaction of the stock market the minute it comes out, and then you saw the reaction the next day across the world, where people were like, oh, we can implement it cheaper and faster and easier, and there's a reaction, right? But at the end of the day, I think you're 100% right. If you don't have this human-centered approach, and you don't really consider, like, it's a human you're replacing. These are real people with real thoughts, with real goals, with real ambitions, and it's humans work. Like, you should be doing this stuff with care. And also the onus on we're getting very philosophical at this point, but also the onus on the companies that are looking to shift. Like, people will remember if you just mass laid off 300,000 people and replaced them with AI and didn't consider the
Mm-hmm.
translation of your implementation, right? I do think in the future, though, AI is going to do great for humanity, but it's got to be done correctly.
We're in a real period of transition. It's going to be, I think it's going to be rocky, but you're going to see two paths emerge where companies take strategic. Is can I use AI to maximize my short-term profits, right? I'm going to replace payroll with an $8 an hour agent, and that's going to look great to shareholder value. And next quarter, we showed tremendous profit. That is unsustainable. I read a book called Good to Great once. I'd say I'll plug that. I don't think we get paid to plug books, but it's an incredibly poignant story about how businesses that take this slower approach win long term versus companies that prioritize short term profits really struggle and ultimately fold. So, I'm not inventing this. This has been around for decades, these thoughts, but AI exacerbates it. So, and I think the other path would be what you said, Shea, right? People are going to stand out from the herd. If everybody's using AI, the same, 3 tools, and it's kind of a regression to the mean in a way. Like, if everything's average, it's easy to stand out if you're just slightly good. And eventually, that should be the path people move towards. So that's where I think if people all the things I've said thus far. I don't need to repeat it, but like, take a second, think about strategy, where you want to go, and how, as a business, you have to care for your customers. Your customers are the number one thing. Like, I don't understand how people sometimes forget that, but like, they pay you to do something for them. They're the person in charge of your company's success. And as a salesperson, I've felt succeeded because I've cared more about what the customer needs than anything else, and that's allowed me to connect and win. As long as I'm advocating for the customer's needs, even against my own internal operations and policies, I gain that trust. So I always think customers, it's not customers always right, but you need to win customer trust, and lots of books I read on that too. So it's a winning formula in my mind. But yeah, it's interesting times.
Yeah, a lot of change. All right, we're running long, guys. I think we need to probably let people go do their lunch. So if you are listening to this on a podcast, please thank you for listening. If you're watching us on YouTube, we'd appreciate a like and a subscribe. Helps us out a lot. And we're going to catch you next time on Lunchtime Babbling.